So we're getting back to our Reaper Bones Giant series, and our second to last giant paint is the Frost Giant. There's a couple different ways you can go about painting a Frost Giant. You can paint him as a Frost Giant, or I think some people may be more inclined to paint it as an Ice Giant, something that looks more like everything's created out of ice. So a lot of whites and very light blues. I was leaning more in the direction of more of a giant that just lives in a very cold environment, so would have very light skin, but the rest of his accoutrements would be more neutral colors. But we'll get more into that as we move on. Starting off with the flesh, and we're starting off with a base of Vallejo Game Color Somber Gray, which has a nice blue medium tone to it. I initially wanted something closer to white. That was my goal, because the Cloud Giant I did last was blue, and I wanted something that was obviously different from that. But this somber gray tone here is basically just the starting palette to get me into the zone, and we're going to build up to this color, or away from this color, much more close to a much whiter white. For our next coat, we mixed the somber gray, which is now called Shadow Gray, in case you go out and buy it today. I forgot that Vallejo did change the name. And to that I've mixed in some Game Color Glacier Blue, a very appropriate color. So we mix these two together, and I almost called it Somber Gray again, the Shadow Gray, we're just leaving that in the recesses. Like I said, I usually just like to start with a very dark color that just is roughly in the ballpark, just so it's, the first step in the direction of the paint job. So the Shadow Gray is getting me into that blue tone. It's better to build off of that than off the straight black, and it's helping me build up those lighter colors, so they will in turn end up lighter, as opposed to if we just did the Glacier Blue, for example, straight off the black. It's going to be very dark and take multiple coats to cover really well. Our third coat is the same mixture as before, just with more of the Glacier Blue added. And at this point we can start defining the muscles much better. And this guy is ripped, so we have lots of really easily to define muscles to highlight. We're just leaving that previous color in the deepest recesses, the undercuts of the muscles. But this coat is going on about 80% of the muscles at this point. The paint is getting a bit thinner at this point as well, so this is built up, I'd say about 3 coats total until it got to the level that I wanted it to be at. At this point, we've moved on to working with just straight Glacier Blue, and kind of at this point I realized this wasn't coming out exactly how I wanted. I wanted something more pure white with a slight blue undertone, but after building up over the Shadow Gray, a lot of that blue was still coming through. I decided to keep going on because I didn't have it wasn't bad, it just wasn't what I was expecting. I could have kept going on and adding more white and redo some of the shadows, but I decided we're on a good path here. But we did end up with a bit more of a very light blue tone to it. Our final highlight, we've added some white to our Glacier Blue, and proceeding to add the final highlights. Paint is pretty thin right now. Usually on the final highlights on the edge work, I say normally you can go with a thicker paint, but we don't really have any real sharp edges here to do that properly on. We have a lot of rounded surfaces, so the paint is still pretty thin, and I'm building up after a couple layers. But the sharp points for the highlights will be the tops of the muscles, the cheeks, tops of the nose, top of the nose, the knuckles would be another good area as well. Considered going on to like straight whites, but I knew I would start over highlighting it too much. When you have your extreme dark colors like black, or your very light colors like whites, or in this case a very light blue, it's very easy to over highlight or overshadow, and you don't want to do that because those colors are going to be very limited when it comes to highlighting or shading, because they are so light or so dark. So we could have actually done away with some of the shadow work here and lighten up the shadows if I wanted to that is a possibility. But again, I decided the flesh was looking pretty good. Not quite what I wanted, but we were doing pretty good at this point. The next thing we're going to paint is the fur, and there's two different sections. Well, I painted it as two different sections of fur on this miniature, and we're going to go over two slightly different techniques for painting fur. Starting off with the cloak. I wanted a fairly light color, not pure white, because I didn't want to go for that ice giant look. But we are going to make it pretty light beige. And so we're starting off with Vallejo Model Color Beige mixed with a little bit of Game Color Leather Brown to darken it slightly. And we're just putting it all over and doing our best to cover up the black. Again, like with the Shadow Gray, this is just our base coat to get us into that ballpark area of the proper color. With our basic color established, we can now start going with the main color, and that is just straight beige, and it is very heavily dry brushed over the fur. Just putting a lot on the brush, just barely touching the towel and scrubbing really hard, leaving some of that previous color in the recesses just for a little bit of flair. Most of it's going to get covered up as we get to the wash stages, but we're just adding a little bit more definition to it at this point. There are two ways to paint flesh, and you can use any combination of the two. It's washes and dry brushes, and we're going to be using both about 50-50 on this one here. Starting off, we're giving the whole thing a light wash with Game Color Sepia Ink, thinned to the proper consistency. Then once that is dry, we reapply another wash, this time with sepia and a little bit of black added. And this is more concentrated towards the center of the fur cape and along the edges as well, where I need a bit more shadow work. This isn't done in just one coat. This is done in multiple coats, so we can darken the fur entirely, and you just have to be sure that the previous layer is completely dry before adding the next layer of ink. Otherwise you'll rub the first one off, and it's really hard to fix it if that happens. And then finally we use a wash of straight black ink, and you can see each color is being more concentrated towards the center of the cape. So it's like the back running down the middle of a wolf or whatever this fur was taken from. So trying to recreate the color variation you would see on the animal itself. So this is being put in on a smaller and smaller area, and also just like with the previous layer, applied in multiple coats as needed until we darken it to its proper color. So with the washes all done, we can now go on to the dry brushing and put on the highlights. First off, we're going back to our original model color beige that we used at the beginning, and doing a overall dry brush. We're concentrating more on the edges of the fur, but we're drawing in a little bit into that darkened area that we put in the center. So we have a nice smooth transition between the dark areas and the light areas. Hopefully it looks very natural. That's what we're trying to achieve here. Next comes Pale Sand, and again working this out towards the edges, but drawing a little bit over the previous areas that we painted. Don't want to go as far into the dark areas that we did as with the beige, but just bringing in a little bit. Again, trying to get a nice smooth color transition between all of our different colors. On to the rest of the fur on the miniature now, and we're going to concentrate more on, lean more heavily towards the dry brushing technique, because these are areas around the feet and around the gauntlets are much smaller, so we don't have to worry about trying to do as much color transition. I'm using a mix of Vallejo Model Color German Gray, mixed with white, mainly because I didn't have a cool enough gray paint in my collection, so I decided to just make my own using the German gray and the white. So this is an overall base coat taking care of all the fur around the gauntlets and the feet. Now we can start the dry brushing. This is the same mixture as before, simply with just more of the white added. And this dry brushing, again, unlike the back where we had a much larger surface area to work with, this is much more of a smaller area, so the dry brush is getting applied overall. It's not like we're concentrating on just the center or the tips or anything like that. And then we have game color Stonewall Gray, so we switched our grays because as they get lighter, your grays tend to lose the warm or cool tone to them. Also, when painting furs, I really like changing the color up slightly rather than just using the same 3 or so colors to dry brush up. You know, your dark brown, medium brown, light brown. I really like mixing a little bit of warms and cool colors and combinations of those when it comes to painting something like natural fur, because you're going to have a lot of variation when it comes to real life animals. And then finally we finished off with a very light glaze using model color Burnt Umber. Like I said, I like mixing in different colors when it comes to painting natural furs. And so adding a little brown makes it look more realistic. And also I wanted a little bit of dirt in the fur, because this is clothing, shoes, and what have you. It's going to get dirty. So adding just a little bit of brown in those areas really helps make the fur much more, ironically, I know, but alive. So I'm using paint here instead of ink because the paint is easier to glaze on. Even very thin, the ink would more likely go in the recesses, but the paint is easier to build up because it dries quicker, and after a few glazes I built it up subtly enough to have that color just slightly noticeable. On to his hair, and that's one of many things that really disappoints me with this sculpt. He doesn't have a big long beard. A frost giant especially needs a big long beard, especially since this is supposed to be a frost giant king, but all we have is really heavy sideburns and a short haircut. Bummer. Anyway, we need to add some more blue into the miniature because we're going to be adding blue on the sword, and I need to bring that color more to the central area of the figure. So we are base coating the hair with some Vallejo model color Sky Blue. Highlights are done very simply. Just add white to the sky blue and leave the sky blue at the base and do kind of a sort of a dry brush with the paint. I don't want to get it in all the recesses, but some of the raised areas we want to fill in with this color. And then finally, we just highlight the edges or the tips of the hair with a little bit of straight, pure white. So really easy to paint, again, because we're using a very light color. A few coats is all you need. Now for the ice sword, and I would complain about the ridiculousness of a sword made of ice, but this is fantasy, so I guess it's a magic ice sword. Even though ice is clear, we're going to paint this with light blue tinge to it because people do think that ice is blue, even though that's only true for ice over large bodies of water. But let's just get into the painting. Started off by base coating it with some Vallejo game color Magic Blue. And then over that I am dry brushing heavily with model color Sky Blue, the same color that we used on the hair. Next is once again Sky Blue, but this time painted in a regular fashion. The dry brushing was just to help to pick out some of the edges, and now I'm using the thinned down Sky Blue to better define the edges here, because this is an ice sword. We want nice, crisp, hard edging for the highlights. Then comes Sky Blue mixed with white, again just like we did on the hair. However, this time it's being used a bit thicker than we used on the hair, and also again we're trying to do a bit more definition on the edging, working our way out from the center, the blood channel of the sword. And then finally, pure white just for the tips. At this point, we painted all the other areas of the model and flat varnished it, and now I have to apply the snow flock. For that, I'm using Woodland Scenic Snow, which is my favorite snow material. And it's mixed with white glue to help it stick, and a little bit of water to make it a bit more easy to apply. And I'm just applying it with an old brush. Applying a heavy amount. I'm going to do a whole floor, and I painted the base underneath Glacier Blue, so hopefully a little bit of that blue may show up here and there. Normally, I would be very cautious about putting the snow on other areas of the miniature itself. That's one of my pet peeves, along with painting a whole bunch of blood on a miniature, is when you have snow stuck all over a miniature. However, in this case, I did add a little bit to the legs and a little bit to the cloak, because it is fur, and fur would be more likely to have snow stick to it a bit more than cloth or a sword or something like that. And our miniature is all finished now. I did skip over a few things that I had difficulties with, and I didn't want to make this video twice as long painting redundant items. The pants was the only other main concern on the miniature, and I did paint those as a brown color. Like I said before, I wanted a frost giant and an ice giant, so I didn't go for like white or blue. I wanted something else that would stand out a bit more. The miniature itself I have issues with. It's not the bones material in this case, and it's not the ability of the sculptor, but transferring the sculpt into the casting. It's the casting I have an issue with. A lot of the details just got muddied and confused, and I couldn't tell what was what. Like especially on the gauntlets, I couldn't tell what was metal, what was leather, what was bone, and what was rope, because they all look the same when they're unpainted. If this was done in different material, resin, and done in multiple pieces, that would have really improved the casting. Other than that, I'm pretty sure this is the same sculptor that did all the fire giants. I don't like the very tiny feet on the miniature, which is the same issue I had with the fire giants, and also I don't like the lack of wrists. They're just so bulky. I think those gauntlets really should be much smaller. I would have liked that a whole lot better. One improvement I could have made was, or if you can do if you're following along, I would put a little bit more putty into the neck head joint area, sculpt some more fur on there, because I really didn't notice it until the end. There's a really obvious line from where the hair ends and where the skin starts, especially on the right side of the head. But overall, okay miniature, decent paint job, I think. I really want to do the Gale Force 9 Frost Giant though, to try a few different items, but we'll have to save that for another time. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time.